Over the last 25 years, Resident Evil has continually changed and evolved as Capcom has tried different mixes of survival horror and action gameplay. With Resident Evil 7, Capcom swung for the fences with a first-person perspective and more classic, horror-focused gameplay. Its sequel, Resident Evil Village, evolves that idea to make something that feels very different from its predecessor, but which is just as engaging. Though the perspective and the mechanical underpinnings are the same, Village branches off in its own direction from RE7, capturing some of the things that were great about that game while resisting the impulse to retread the same ground. While it's still frightening at points, it takes a less horror-driven tack on the same formula. Village continues to evolve Resident Evil while maintaining a keen grasp on some of its core tenets, finding new ways, or reviving old ones, of getting under your skin and ratcheting up the tension.
Where the hell am I?
As has been pretty clear for a while now, Resident Evil Village is Resident Evil 7 through the lens of Resident Evil 4. When the latter was released back in 2005, it totally revamped what the franchise had been up to that point, swapping the earlier game's slower survival horror focus for a more fast-paced action approach, trading darkened corridors and jump scares for adrenaline-fueled panic. Village adds to RE7 by taking its cues from the faster, panickier RE4. It's again played from a tight, closed-in, first-person perspective, and it still often focuses on slower movement and exploration. But Village's approach is distinctly more action-centric, and it's remarkable how much Capcom has managed to push the underlying formula of its reboot to the series in such a different direction. Village picks up on Resident Evil 7's story 3 years later, again focusing on protagonist Ethan Winters. After rescuing his wife Mia from the Baker house and subsequently getting saved by Resident Evil franchise mainstay Chris Redfield, Ethan and Mia went into hiding with Chris's help, moving to Europe to restart their lives. They've since had a daughter, but their lives are upended again when Chris and his team bust into the couple's house and drag Ethan and baby Rose off. Ethan wakes up sometime later after a car crash. The two random Special Forces guys who were transporting him and Rose are dead. Ethan wanders through the snowy woods in search of his missing child until he hits a ramshackle, seemingly empty village. Before long, he discovers it's under siege by what appeared to be werewolves. It's all extremely reminiscent of the beginning of Resident Evil 4, which upended the RE formula by dropping you into a village overrun with enemies who acted like humans rather than shambling, mindless zombies. The lycans you face wield weapons and shoot arrows at you, and to avoid getting surrounded, you can run into houses and barricade the doors with furniture to slow their advances. Just like its 2005 inspiration, the opening battle of Village taps into a frightening intensity of trying to create a defensible position or take part in a running gunfight that you're in serious danger of losing. It's a completely different feeling from the slow burn dread of RE7, but Village's combat can make your heart pound just as hard. The fact that Village feels like such a turn away from RE7 is what works about it. As a sequel, it feels like Capcom reaching for a new way to challenge itself. Most of the time in Village, at least on its standard difficulty, you'll find yourself pretty well outfitted for whatever you're about to face. The challenge is in using those resources effectively and keeping yourself alive. Village uses the same movement system as RE7, which can feel a little slow and clunky at times. Ethan isn't especially agile, and even at a sprint, it can feel like he's barely moving. Despite a sense of trudging through mud, Village is tuned so that enemies also approach slowly and cautiously, so dealing with them comes together like a standoff that has you judging their moves or hitting their weak points before they have a chance to get in close and rip into you. And sometimes you just have to run and hope you can find a better place to make your stand. While the controls add tension when you're surrounded, they can be a bit obtuse, making it difficult to avoid attacks. You're often dodging attacks as a monster charges you or swings at you with a huge weapon. You can absorb some damage with the ability to hold up your hands in a guard, another RE7 feature that helps mitigate the limitations of your movement. But the better strategy is to try to run around the battlefield and get out of the way. That usually means sacrificing seeing what your opponent is doing. Since Ethan can't step sideways while looking forward, you're constantly just running and hoping whatever is coming at you doesn't hit you. It doesn't make these battles frustrating or add to their difficulty, but it does add a counterintuitiveness to combat that can take you out of the moment. Bullets are easy to come by, and if you're short, you can craft more from materials you find, or purchase them from the Duke, a traveling merchant. All that stuff you're carrying around has to go somewhere, so Village brings back the inventory management system of RE4. You have a suitcase full of weapons, ammo, and health items, with each taking up space on a grid. You can move items around to make sure they all fit in your case, Tetris style, and purchase bigger cases from the Duke so you can bring more stuff. The system is most interesting when it starts making you wonder if you should sell off old guns or toss less useful items in favor of things like extra ammo. Mercifully, crafting items don't count against your inventory space, so you're free to make bullets and health items on the fly. On standard difficulty, it was never a big concern, but you do have to start thinking about keeping space open as you explore in case you find something essential. Though Village has far more variety of enemies to fight than RE7, it's not all shooting, with a lot of varied pacing and new challenges throughout. There are 4 different areas to unlock as you progress through the story, each headed by one of the 4 lords, the scary monster people who dominate the village and the area around it. After the opening village, the first is the castle run by Lady Dimitrescu, where there's a lot less shooting to be done. You'll occasionally face enemies you have to gun down, but much more time in the castle is spent navigating its tight corridors, as you're hunted by the vampire Dimitrescu and her daughters. You can't kill the vampires with your conventional weapons, so you have to run if you're found. The entire level is spent exploring the castle, looking for the items you need to advance through the area, while listening for Dimitrescu's clomping footsteps and trying to keep away from her. Even in this first new area, Village is mixing and remixing its experience with different horror ideas. You're not just shotgunning a ton of enemies, you're also engaging in stealth, more akin to what navigating the Baker House was like in RE7. And later portions of the game throw different obstacles into your path. There are areas that are full of puzzles that are reminiscent of the mansion of Resident Evil or the police station of RE2. There are sections where you hear frightfully powerful enemies in the distance you know you'll have to fight. And there are points that show Village can still hone in on some of the intense frights that made RE7 so remarkable. Suffice to say that Village is great at maintaining an atmosphere of unease as you head around each new corner. Sure, you have plenty of weapons, but can you handle what you're about to face? Will they even work against the next creature you encounter? There's an excellent balance between providing lots of action and maintaining that dread. Village encourages its own kind of fear, and it hits you with a few great RE7-like set pieces to ratchet up the tension when you least expect it. No 2 sections of Village are quite the same. Each draws on different aspects of past Resident Evil games and combines them with that underlying RE7 feel to create something that's both new and nostalgic. It's impressive how the game can change to be a little different again and again throughout its runtime, mixing in other ideas from the franchise to make each section fun, intense, and, naturally, frightening in its own way. The exception to that is the last hour of the game, where things take a weird, over-the-top turn. In the run-up to Village's final moments, the action gets turned up even higher. It seems like a needless digression, where Village draws on the worst action-heavy portions of Resident Evil 6, losing track of what made you grit your teeth and clench your fists, and exchanging it for something more akin to shooters like Call of Duty. This same moment highlights some of the inconsistency in Village's story. Though the game's imagery recalls the Umbrella logo from past games, Village's connection to the rest of the franchise feels a bit tacked on. The same is true of Chris Redfield, whose presence in the story feels like an afterthought. Ethan's interactions with the 4 lords and the mystery of the village is more fun and interesting, since the antagonists come off as petty, flawed, and human. They don't particularly like each other, but are all eager to torture and maim you anyway, and their interactions with Ethan and each other add dimension to their characters.
Lycans and gentlemen, we thank you for waiting. And now let the games begin!
Village is a spooky romp with fun villains, but it's just a shame that more time wasn't devoted to the hanging story threads of RE7 or the franchise at large. Thankfully, that digression doesn't last long. Meanwhile, the elements about combat that are fun are transplanted into the fast-paced arcade mode, the Mercenaries.
Start.
The mode takes the combat of the village, slaps a timer on it, and focuses it on scoring points. The Mercenaries is a fun side activity in its own right, always daring you to get a higher score by balancing taking down as many enemies as you can and trying to complete one of its given levels as fast as you can. It demonstrates how tight the combat in Village can be, although at times it can be held back a bit by the slow underwater feeling of movement around the battlefield. Resident Evil 7 was an excellent return to the horror roots of the franchise with some cunning new ideas. Similarly, Village is an intelligent reimagination of the best action elements of Resident Evil. Though it captures some of the same things that made RE7 such a breath of fresh air, Village uses new takes on the ideas of the past to evolve into its own unique creature.